In October 2007, Singapore Airlines made aviation history. The airline took delivery of the world's largest passenger jet, the Airbus A380, a double-decker Superjumbo powered by 4 massive engines and boasting a wingspan of 262 feet, longer than an Olympic-sized swimming pool. It was a bold bet by a relatively small nation's flag carrier to become the launch customer for this giant plane. Just days later, on October 25, 2007, Flight SQ380 departed Singapore for Sydney, with a full load of excited passengers who had paid between $560 and $100,380 for seats via a charity auction. This inaugural A380 flight was a global media event, a star-studded debut complete with champagne in first-class suites and a shower of publicity. The one-off ticket auction raised about $1.3 million for charity, underscoring both the fanfare and the high stakes surrounding the Superjumbo's introduction. For Singapore Airlines, SIA, a carrier from a city-state of just 5 million people, staking its reputation on the biggest airliner ever built was a daring move. Why did SIA gamble on the A380, and has that gamble paid off? In the late 1990s, Airbus engineers envisioned a jet that could carry more people per flight than ever before, promising about a 15 to 20% reduction in operating costs per seat compared to the reigning jumbo of the time, Boeing's 747-400. The logic followed the classic hub-and-spoke model of aviation. Use giant planes to ferry travelers between major hub airports, then distribute them onward on smaller flights. Airbus pursued this vision after conducting an extensive market analysis, with over 200 focus groups to test the concept. The result was the A380 program, codenamed A3XX in its development. Officially launched in December 2000, with a projected development cost of €9.5 billion and 50 firm orders from 6 launch customers lined up. Singapore Airlines was foremost among those early believers. In September 2000, even before Airbus had finalized the A380's design, SIA agreed to buy 25 of the new jets at a list price of $8.6 billion. By making this commitment, Singapore's flag carrier signaled its confidence in the hub-and-spoke dream. The idea that ever bigger aircraft would efficiently connect global gateway cities like Singapore, London, and Sydney. At the time, Changi Airport was growing into a major intercontinental hub, and SIA's entire business was built on carrying international passengers. There are no domestic flights in Singapore. A larger capacity plane promised to multiply SIA's hub efficiency, for example, by allowing more passengers per slot at slot-constrained destinations such as London Heathrow. In theory, the A380 would let SIA maximize each precious flight slot into busy airports while offering travelers a new level of comfort. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Boeing was taking the opposite strategic bet. Rather than build an even bigger 747, Boeing focused on developing smaller, long-range twin jets like the 777 and later the 787 Dreamliner to enable more point-to-point flights between secondary cities. Airbus's A380 approach was in line with traditional hub-and-spoke theory, as opposed to the point-to-point theory favored by Boeing's 777/787 strategy. This divergence set the stage for an aviation gamble. Would the future belong to massive hub connectors or nimble non-stops? Airbus was betting on consolidation of traffic through megahubs. Boeing was betting on fragmentation of routes with more direct flights. For SIA, firmly rooted in the hub model, the A380's promise was very attractive. The airline had a history of operating large aircraft. It was also a prolific Boeing 747 customer in its day, and using Singapore's geographic position to connect east and west. The Superjumbo represented the next evolutionary step, an airliner so large that it could rewrite the cost equation on high-density routes. In theory, SIA could carry significantly more passengers per flight with an A380 while actually lowering the cost per seat mile thanks to the new jet's efficiency and scale. This was the hub-and-spoke dream in a nutshell, and SIA was keen to turn it into reality. Being the launch customer of a brand new aircraft is a prestige boost, but it also comes with risks. As SIA would discover, the A380's road from concept to service was anything but smooth. The airline originally expected to receive its first A380 in 2006, but production delays plagued Airbus's giant project. Complex wiring installations and assembly issues pushed the schedule back again and again. By the time the first A380 was finally ready in October 2007, it was a full 19 months behind schedule. SIA's then CEO, Chu Choon-seng, was vocal in expressing frustration at Airbus for the delays. Airbus's struggles to coordinate manufacturing across multiple countries for such a large aircraft became legendary in the industry. When that inaugural A380, tail number 9 VSKA, was handed over in Toulouse on October 15, 2007, Chu Choon-seng's tone changed to one of pride. He famously dubbed the new aircraft the new Queen of the Skies, a nod to the Boeing 747's longtime nickname. SIA was effectively crowning a successor. The age of the double-decker Superjumbo had arrived. 10 days later, on October 25th, SIA operated the world's first A380 commercial flight from Singapore to Sydney, as mentioned earlier. Flight SQ380's departure was covered live on television in some markets and streamed online, illustrating the enormous public interest. From the start, SIA made its A380 uniquely its own. Instead of cramming the maximum 853 passengers on board, the A380's certified capacity, SIA opted for a spacious 471-seat layout in 4 classes. This included innovations that redefined luxury aloft. The airline introduced the concept of the Singapore Airlines suites, a collection of private mini-cabins in first class. Each suite featured a sliding door, a fully flat bed, and even the option to join 2 center suites into a double bed for couples. It was essentially a hotel room in the sky, something the A380's abundant space made possible. SIA's A380 also boasted an all-business class upper deck on some aircraft and generously pitched economy seats, emphasizing comfort over brute capacity. The airline sacrificed some potential seats to install lounges and premium amenities, knowing that winning high-paying customers would help justify this massive investment. The A380, in SIA's hands, became not just a people mover, but a flying showcase for the brand's renowned service and comfort. Behind the scenes, SIA's teams prepared intensively for the A380's entry into service. Pilots underwent months of training in simulators for the 4-engine behemoth. Cabin crew were trained to handle over 450 passengers at a time, including in new service concepts like the Suites class, with its double beds and gourmet dining. Engineers in Singapore upgraded ground handling equipment, new double-decker jet bridges, special tow bars, and larger hangars to accommodate the world's largest airliner. This was a whole new chapter for the airline. Once in service, the A380 initially delivered on many of its promises for SIA. Within 2 months of operations, SIA's CEO reported that the A380 was performing better than expected, burning 20% less fuel per seat mile than the 747-450s it had replaced. The aircraft's advanced aerodynamics and new generation Rolls-Royce Trent 900 engines were living up to their billing in terms of efficiency. Passengers, for their part, raved about the experience. The cabin was markedly quieter than older jets, the ride smoother, and the ambience more spacious. SIA's decision to bet on the A380 was looking like a masterstroke, at least in those early days. The airline rapidly integrated the Superjumbo on its flagship routes, Singapore-Sydney, then Singapore-London Heathrow, and later Tokyo, Paris, Hong Kong, and others. By 2009, SIA's A380s had flown over 1 million passengers, and load factors were high, aided by the novelty factor drawing travelers to try the new plane. Yet, behind the optimistic headlines, the economic reality of the A380 was beginning to present challenges for SIA and many other airlines. For all its size and efficiency per seat, the A380 was extremely expensive to operate in absolute terms. Estimates put the operating cost at around $30,000 per flight hour for an A380 in typical service. This means a long-haul flight of 14 to 15 hours could easily cost on the order of $400,000 just to operate, before factoring in any profit margin. An aircraft that is expensive to fly simply must generate huge revenue on each journey. In other words, airlines need to fill most of the seats and charge enough per ticket to cover those massive trip costs. If an A380 took off half empty or with too low fares, it could quickly become a money loser. Over time, analysts concluded that an A380 in typical 3-class layout, around 500 seats, might need roughly an 80 to 85% load factor just to break even on a flight, a very high bar to meet consistently. By comparison, a smaller widebody like a Boeing 787 might break even at around 60 to 70% full. The Superjumbo's economics left little room for error. You had to fill it, or you'd bleed money. This was manageable on certain trunk routes during peak travel periods, but risky if demand fluctuated. And when demand was too high, passengers often preferred more flight frequency, multiple departures per day, over a single giant flight, a preference that favors smaller aircraft flying more often. Another issue was that SIA and other premium carriers deliberately did not use the A380 to its maximum seating capacity. The A380 could technically carry 800-plus passengers in an all-economy layout, but no airline chose to do that. SIA's 470-seat configuration, and even the densest operators like Emirates stayed around 615 seats in 2-class format, meant the A380's vaunted cost-per-seat advantage was never fully realized in practice. In fact, an A380 configured with only 450 seats has significantly higher fuel burn per passenger than one configured with 600-plus seats. As Airbus itself noted, if you don't use the available space, you lose efficiency. An A380 with around 525 seats uses about 3.5 litres of fuel per 100 passenger kilometres versus 2.4 litres per 100 passengers per kilometre if it were somehow filled with 853 people. Airlines like SIA chose to forego some efficiency in exchange for a superior passenger experience. Fewer seats, more room. That was great for travellers, but it narrowed the financial margins further. The A380 only truly shined, cost-wise, when you crammed it full, something SIA was reluctant to do as a 5-star premium carrier. Crucially, market conditions were changing in ways that undermined the A380's original rationale. In the decade after the A380's launch, the aviation industry saw a clear shift toward point-to-point service and right-sizing of aircraft. Airlines began flying more non-stop routes between secondary cities, bypassing the traditional big hubs. For example, SIA itself opened new non-stop routes from Singapore to places like Seattle, Manchester, and Düsseldorf, using smaller long-range jets, routes that could never support an A380's volume. As one analysis noted, airlines were moving away from the pure hub-and-spoke model and launching more direct services to smaller markets, routes perfect for a 787 or A350, but impossible for an A380 to serve profitably. At the same time, the latest twin-engine jets, like the Boeing 777-300ER and Airbus A350-900, were proving extraordinarily efficient and versatile. They could carry 300 to 350 passengers almost as far as an A380, at significantly lower operating cost. In essence, the A380 was a bet on consolidation, but the industry's growth was coming from fragmentation. More point-to-point flights and more frequency were the order of the day, especially as open skies agreements and new aircraft technology unlocked city pairs that were previously unviable. On the supply side, Airbus struggled to sell A380s beyond the initial burst of orders. The global financial crisis in 2008 to 2009, followed by persistently high fuel prices in the early 2010s, made airlines skittish about giant, fuel-thirsty planes. Over the years, Airbus repeatedly revised down its production rates and sales targets for the A380. By 2019, the verdict was in. The A380 program would be terminated. Airbus had once optimistically predicted a market for approximately 1,200 very large airliners, VLA, over 20 years, but in reality, only 251 A380s were ever delivered to airlines. The last new A380 rolled out of Airbus's factory in 2021. The manufacturer never recouped the roughly $25 billion spent on the jet's development. In Airbus's own words, the A380 was so marginal in its impact on the market that it posed little threat to Boeing's lineup. The program, economically, was a failure for Airbus, sustained primarily by one big customer, Emirates, and a handful of prestige-oriented airlines like SIA, Qantas, and British Airways. For Singapore Airlines, the economic reality of the A380 manifested in fleet decisions by the mid-2010s. In 2017, less than 10 years after that jubilant first flight, SIA retired its first A380, the same aircraft 9VSKA that had flown the inaugural service. This move surprised some observers. The aircraft was relatively young, but SIA chose not to renew its lease. Despite being advertised back in 2007 as the plane for today and tomorrow, the A380 had struggled to live up to expectations on flexibility and profitability. Its massive size made it difficult to consistently fill, and therefore difficult to make money. Over the next year, SIA removed 4 of its early A380s from service as their leases ended. Rather tellingly, none of those used A380s found a new mainstream airline operator. Instead, they were returned to a leasing company and eventually parted out for spares, essentially scrapped for their engines and components, because no secondary buyer wanted them. Seeing a cutting-edge 10-year-old airplane scrapped was almost unheard of in aviation history, and it underscored the A380's predicament. The second-hand market perceived the A380 as overly specialized and costly. Even if you got the plane for free, operating it could be uneconomical without the right routes. SIA's gamble had turned into a cautionary tale for lessors as well. The carrier had originally ordered 25 A380s, including later top-up orders, but ultimately operated at most 19 at any one time and would not replace the retired ones. Essentially, SIA capped its A380 fleet and pivoted to smaller widebodies for growth, such as the efficient Airbus A350 and Boeing 787, which started arriving in its fleet toward the late 2010s. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic delivered an unprecedented shock to global aviation. International travel demand collapsed by as much as 98% at the peak of lockdowns. Airlines big and small scrambled to survive, grounding the majority of their aircraft and slashing networks. For the Airbus A380, a jet that thrives on high density and consistent demand, it was an especially brutal turn of events. SIA, with its entirely international network, had to park virtually its entire fleet for months. The A380 was quickly singled out as excess to immediate needs, too large to justify flying with such low passenger numbers. In April 2020, SIA flew the first batch of its A380s to long-term storage in the desert of Alice Springs, Australia. More were stored in subsequent months, until 12 of SIA's 19 A380s sat idle in the outback sun. By November 2020, Singapore Airlines made the difficult announcement that it would permanently retire 7 A380s, reducing its post-pandemic Superjumbo fleet to the newest 12 aircraft. The pandemic had essentially forced SIA's hand to accelerate fleet rationalization. The airline's management noted that while the A380 was much loved by customers, it was also aging and not as fuel efficient as newer types in the fleet. Storing and maintaining so many unused jumbo jets was economically unsustainable. Thus, SIA's future A380 cadre would consist of only the dozen youngest airframes, which had more life remaining and the latest cabin features. The rest, including some of the original 2007 deliveries, were to be scrapped or sold off. It was a melancholy moment. The very plane that had headlined SIA's fleet for a decade was now being culled in large numbers. At the time, many industry watchers wondered if this was effectively the curtain call for the A380 at SIA. The outlook for global travel was uncertain, and several other airlines, Air France, Lufthansa, etc., chose to retire all their A380s during the pandemic crisis. SIA kept the door open, however, to bringing back the remaining 12 when conditions improved. In late 2021, as vaccination rates climbed and travel restrictions eased, long-haul travel began a modest recovery. True to its word, SIA reactivated a pair of A380s and even returned the Superjumbo to service on November 18, 2021, flying a celebrated reinstatement flight from Singapore to London Heathrow. This was a strong signal that the A380 still had a role to play for SIA under the right conditions, specifically on high-demand routes where its capacity and amenities could shine. Throughout 2022 and 2023, Singapore Airlines gradually pulled more A380s out of storage and refurbished them. The airline took the downtime as an opportunity to upgrade the cabins of all 12 remaining jets to its newest product standards. This was a significant investment, reflecting a belief that these planes would be useful for years to come. The refit program saw older interiors, from 2007 and 2012 fits, ripped out and brand new suites, business class, premium economy, and economy seats installed, matching what SIA had debuted on 5 new A380s just before the pandemic. By December 2023, the last of the 12 had completed its refit and returned to service. At that point, all 12 of SIA's post-pandemic A380 fleet were active, primarily deployed on the airline's largest international routes. Each now features a 471-seat, 4-class layout, 6 suites, 78 business class, 44 premium economy, and 343 economy. In effect, SIA doubled down on making the A380 a luxury liner for key routes, with each jet offering more premium seats, especially business class, than before. Where are these Superjumbos flying? SIA has been using them to serve destinations where demand is robust and airport slots are limited. London Heathrow, for example, is a mainstay A380 route. The Heathrow-Singapore flights are often full, and using the A380 allows SIA to carry up to 150 more passengers per flight than a smaller aircraft would. Similarly, SIA schedules A380s to Sydney on popular departures, as well as to cities like Shanghai, Mumbai, and Hong Kong during peak travel seasons. These routes play to the A380's strengths. An A380 can replace what might otherwise be 2 separate flights, or it can absorb growth in passenger numbers without needing additional flight frequencies. In effect, the A380 remains SIA's solution for routes where demand is high, but adding more flights is impractical due to slot constraints or crew aircraft availability. And importantly, passengers are coming back. The pent-up demand after COVID-19 saw premium cabins booking up and even economy loads rising to healthy levels. In 2023, SIA noted that summer travel demand was strong and that those 471-seat A380s were useful to meet the surge, especially as many other airlines had retired theirs. Singapore Airlines, however, is not planning to acquire any new A380s. That era is over. Instead, the carrier is looking ahead to next-generation aircraft. It has orders for 31 Boeing 777-9 jets, Boeing's upcoming flagship twin jet, and has also ordered Airbus A350F freighters. Notably, SIA will be the launch customer for the A350F, echoing its launch role with the A380, but in a very different category. These plans highlight SIA's pivot to a more fuel-efficient and versatile fleet mix. The 777-9s and A350s will, in time, replace older aircraft like the A380s and A350-900s, providing similar range with lower fuel burn and fewer seats. SIA's fleet strategy post-pandemic is about balance, maintaining some very large aircraft, A380s, for specific missions, but largely relying on mid-sized widebodies for flexibility. The A380s that remain are expected to serve through the latter 2020s, barring any new downturn. Once they do retire, it's likely SIA will not operate aircraft of that size again unless there's a major shift in technology or demand.